Once upon a time, during the early days of Legends of Runeterra, we were told that everything in that game was canon. Naturally, I was really happy to hear that. And immediately we started speculating that if everything is canon, then what's happening with Poros? How come a Poro can survive on the Shadow Isles? Are they immortal? Truly, these were amazing times for lore exploration. Then came Cytherea, a character who was originally introduced during Silas's Mage Rebellion. Back then she was a fresh recruit, and her story was so good Riot used it in Legends of Runeterra, and they expanded her story with more cards. And then she started time traveling. Somehow, despite her joining the military only recently, the interactions of the new card reveal that she is rescuing Jarvan IV in an event that happened about 10 years earlier. And this is where we learned that the Cytherea card is a what-if scenario. What if Cytherea was around a decade earlier as an elite member of the Dauntless Vanguard? And this is what people really didn't like. It suddenly gave us a strange itch. That feeling that maybe everything is not canon. Maybe there are other things that don't quite make sense. Not because there would be some mystery behind them, but simply because the cards don't matter for the story. And this was definitely not helped with the latest story called Fragile Legacies. Now super quickly I have to say, this story, as you'll see, is absolutely amazing. I love it. But it does have a smear on it. The story focuses on Lord Barrett Bevel, Sona's adoptive father, whom we have also seen in the cards before. Just like Cytherea, he was protecting Prince Jarvan IV. However, here we learned that his actual canon story was totally different. The cards mention that Jarvan III regretted sending him out to save his son, because he would never return. While in reality, Lord Barrett Bevel died protecting Jarvan III instead. This could be a bit confusing. So in this video, let's summarize what happened in the latest story before we dive into the issues it brings up. So without further ado, here's the story Fragile Legacies. The story is told from the perspective of Lestara, who, as we know from Sona's bio, would later become her adoptive mother. She was talking about the day she met her future husband, Barrett Bevel, for the first time. Back then, she was Lestara Demacian. She was invited into the halls of Valor to talk to young Jarvan III, who at the time has been the king for less than 2 weeks. And his advisor, right next to him, was none other than Barrett himself. Lestara was aware that she was attractive. She could see that both seemed interested. But that only allowed her to catch them off guard even more, as she announced that she came to talk about the king's failure. She took off her necklace picturing the candle of the Illuminators, and she explained that while the nobles have been doing well, in the 2 weeks of Jarvan III's ruling, the honest Demacians living in the streets had not been properly treated. There was a moment of silence before Barrett laughed out loud. He then quickly moved to Lestara and grabbed her hand, telling her that he would personally oversee a project to house every Demacian. The king was shocked. Of course, he didn't approve any of those words. But after the two childhood friends shared a long glance, the king nodded, adding that the people should have been offered assistance long ago. Flushing, Lestara looked at her hand being held by Barrett. That's when he apologized that it had taken them so long to do what was so obvious to her. This was the first time Lestara heard Barrett speak her name. The last time was just over 6 weeks ago, and she would never hear him again. In the present, as she recalled her husband, it had only been 3 weeks since she lost him. Whenever Barrett was called to attend to his duties, he would leave his home for about 3 months to help the soldiers. Lestara and their daughter Kaina would sometimes visit them at the front, to help him distribute food and supplies, and cheer up the Demacians risking their lives. Barrett was a chaplain. He was never supposed to die in battle, but he was not the only one who did. Lestara was told that battle was unwinnable. Even the Dauntless Vanguard fell before the might of Demacia's enemies. How fitting that the place where her husband and so many others died was known as the Gates of Mourning. Jarvan was ready to hold his funeral the day his body returned, but Lestara told him that those who served the king with their blades, such as the late High Marshal, had to be honored first. So it was only now, 3 weeks later, that Lestara had to find the strength to say goodbye. The first 4 times Barrett asked Lestara to marry him, she said no. As a member of the Illuminators, she wanted to stay fully dedicated to helping those in need. She was allowed to marry, but it would be difficult to balance the needs of a family to her duties. But Barrett was persistent, and with each time he asked her, again and again, her heart would have to weigh the options. It was easy to see the beautiful life she would have with him, and so the decisions became more and more difficult, as slowly, through Barrett's no small effort, she fell in love with him too. Eventually, Lestara turned back to him and told him to start looking for a wife elsewhere, but he answered that he would not marry if it wasn't her. Lestara laughed because she knew the Bevel family would never allow that, but Barrett had his own dedications too. First, he asked Lestara if she loved him. Of course, she said yes. And he asked if she trusted him that he loved her back. Again, she said yes. And so, if that was the case, Barrett told her that the Bevel family amassed a great deal of wealth over the centuries. If she were to ask, he would dedicate it all to the Illuminators, to help all the people of Demacia. For a moment, Lestara was confused. It seemed like he was putting a price on their marriage. Would he not do that if she refused? Wouldn't that go against his honor? Well, Barrett replied that he never mentioned their marriage. He would simply do so if she asked him, so she could guide his hand and show him where he could help the most. Lestara just stared at him. He just dedicated his entire life to her and required nothing from her. How could any man be like this? That's when he added that he would enjoy it more with her in his life. And so he asked her for the 5th time, and she said yes. The day of his funeral, the inns were full, and there were thousands of tents outside the city, all because the halls of valor were not large enough to contain all the people Barrett's good deeds have touched. The halls of valor themselves only held a small crowd. Jarvan had to be selective about who was allowed to go in, but he generously opened the doors to the public for the 2 following weeks. On Lestara's behest, Jarvan allowed an Illuminator to lead the service. It was Mistress Myrtily, Kaina's mentor. Lestara didn't quite pay attention to the ceremony. Instead, she stared at Barrett's shining armor that was repurposed to carry his ashes. It was a tradition to those who died in battle. She did, however, pay attention when others came to speak about Barrett. They usually mentioned how he was a skilled warrior and a safeguard of tradition. But Lestara knew he hadn't fought in a battle for nearly 30 years. He was more interested in aiding the Demacian people than safeguarding the traditions of the noble families. None of those people really knew him, but by far the worst words came from Eldred of the Mage Seekers, who said that Lord Bevel was, at his core, dedicated to ridding Demacia of its worst ills. Him and Barrett were no friends, so even though Lestara knew he was dedicated to improving Demacia, he did not wish to do so in the way Eldred implied. In fact, him and Lestara unknowingly adopted a mage, Sona, and he would never allow her to be taken away. Sona sat beside Lestara now, her tears falling silently as she looked away from the Mage Seeker. The last one to speak was Jarvan, his words directed at Lestara. He talked about how him and Barrett were like brothers. Without him, he wouldn't be the leader he was now. He helped him become the husband and father and the king he was. Barrett touched the souls of everyone he met, and he made them better for it. That's when Sona signed to Lestara that finally someone was talking about her father as he truly was. But then, Jarvan started talking about how Barrett was stolen from them, and how he would pledge himself to hold responsible those who took him away, even if it took him a lifetime, for Jarvan's love for him did not die with him. Even though an applause shook the room, Lestara's heart felt like it was plunged into icy water. It seemed like Jarvan truly believed this is what she wanted. But what was worse, going to war for revenge? Barrett wouldn't want this either. As Kaina and Sona helped Lestara to stand up, finally it was her time to talk. But instead of talking about how much Barrett cared about the people of Demacia, Lestara decided to show them. And so she donated the Bavel residence within the great city to the people of Demacia in Barrett's honor. It would become a library populated with their own private collection for any Demacian to use at any time. Some of the present nobles were shocked, for no other noble house allowed ordinary citizens to pursue their book collections. But Lestara and Barrett discussed this idea about the library years ago. He loved the idea of helping people beyond basic survival, and so, in his honor, this was the least she could do. To finish the ceremony, Lestara allowed Sona to play a song she composed in the memory of her father. Mere moments after the first couple of notes were hit, the halls of valor were in tears. The story then cuts back to the past, to the moment Barrett and Lestara were discussing sponsoring the orphans that were rescued from the Ionian Islands during the Noxian invasion. They managed to rescue 9 orphans, 2 of which were ill, and 1 couldn't speak. The Bavel family had room, however, and so Barrett told the Illuminators that they would house them there, until they would find them new families. Kaina was excited about this, because she loved researching Ionia with her tutors. She wanted to see what holidays they could celebrate together. But when the children arrived, they realized none of them could speak Demacian, and so they communicated with hand gestures and facial expressions. That evening, the house would ring with laughter. But that laughter was then broken by music. It came from Sona, who was playing an instrument 3 times her size. Both Lestara and Barrett were stunned by its beauty, and as soon as they figured out that Sona was the one who couldn't speak, they realized she didn't need to. They hosted 9 orphans for 3 months. 8 of them left, and Sona stayed. Back in the present, the funeral reception was held in the gardens where Lestara said her yes. They received countless mourning nobles who kept Lestara too far in her memories. But among them were those such as Quinn, who saved Barrett's life 2 years ago, while losing the life of her own brother. And there, Quinn asked Lestara if she could talk to Tiana Crownguard on her behalf. Quinn was an aspiring knight after all. Of course, Tiana was promised to Eldred of the Mageseekers, who stood right beside her. But despite being the sword captain at the Gates of Morning during that fateful battle, Tiana was somehow appointed the new High Marshal. After her failure, Lestara didn't understand how that even happened. When the two talked, Tiana was ashamed, and she said that they should talk business another day. Lestara wanted to know when that would be, and Tiana replied something about returning to the front lines next week. And so Lestara said that the two would have a tea in the next few days. Eldred then stepped into the conversation, wondering what kinds of books he would find in the new library. Lestara assured him that there would be no magic. But with fanatism in his eyes, he continued that descriptions of magic can be dangerous too. It seemed like he was suggesting that the Mageseekers should audit the collection first. And so she let him know that she was still Lady Lestara Bavel, and with the prestige of the Bavel family, she didn't believe the king would allow it. But that's when Eldred smiled at her. In case she wasn't aware, it was the Noxian mages who brought down the Gates of Morning. And while Lestara thought that Jarvan wanted to punish the Noxians for that, Eldred confirmed that he was going after mages. The story then goes to the past. Lestara knew Barrett wasn't afraid of mages as some other nobles were, but she still wasn't sure how he would react to her suspicions. So she first told him that if he ever hurt their daughters, she would immediately leave with them and never see him again. Of course, Barrett immediately stopped reading his poetry of the Illuminators, dropped the book on the floor, and demanded to know what she was talking about. He would never do anything to them. Lestara calmed him down by saying that she just wanted him to know that. And then she added that she believed there was more behind Sona's beautiful music. She thought she was using magic. After hearing that, Barrett had a look of wild fear in his eyes, and with breaking voice he asked, how could they keep her safe? Lestara never loved him more than she did in that moment. Back in the present days, After all the nobles left the gardens, it was time for only Lestara and her two daughters to say their goodbyes. In those final moments, Kaina revealed that she wanted to honor her father's commission. She wanted to also become a chaplain. Sort of. She wanted to become a Knight of the Illuminators. This took Lestara by surprise. Knightly Illuminators do their good work in battle, and during times of peace, they are devoted to bettering the kingdom. So devoted, they would not marry nor hold titles. Normally this wouldn't be a problem, but she was meant to inherit the Bevel name. Lestara hugged her tight, not letting her see the worry on her face. She just said that her father would be proud, which was true. As Sona touched her father's tomb, Lestara could see that she was shaken as well. With Kaina joining the Illuminators, Sona would be the remaining heir. Especially since she was an Ionian, and especially since the Mageseekers grew in power, it would be difficult for her. Soon her two daughters said their goodbyes, but Lestara wasn't ready yet. So she told her daughters to go home without her. Soon after that, Jarvan quietly knelt beside Lestara, and he mentioned how he met Barrett as a boy, how he was throwing a tantrum over a game he had lost against another kid, and how Barrett approached him, asking him if that poor stable boy really deserved his abuse. Jarvan shouted at him if he knew who he was, and Barrett answered, of course he knew, and he expected better of him because of it. Jarvan's mind went back to the present, as he told Lestara once again that Barrett made him a better man. Lestara questioned, did he? Jarvan was confused, and so she continued that he wouldn't want his death to be avenged. It was obvious Jarvan knew she was right, but after a while, he confirmed that not everything they do is what the dead want. The living had to go on, finding ways to live. The two then just sat beside each other in silence. It didn't seem like Jarvan wanted to move, but Lestara didn't care to sit right next to him anymore, so she stood up. But before she left, Jarvan told her that she made Barrett a better man. He hoped she knew that. And, of course she did. He told her every day. Jarvan then quickly hugged her. He shook, trying to hold back more sobs. That's when it hit her. Barrett was gone. Her own tears started to fall, and soon she was gasping for air, unable to breathe. The two cried in each other's arms, grief choking them both. Far from the Citadel of Dawn, Sona dragged her trunk out from beneath her bed, trying to not wake her sister up as she emptied her closet. It was mostly performance outfits, and very little of it was practical clothing. It certainly wasn't something to wear by a runaway teenager, but if she was going to support herself away from home, she would need her music and her performance skills to do it. In the 3 weeks since her father's death, Demacian was already different, and Sona knew that the war the king wanted to wage would not be against Noxians. It would be against people like her, so she was leaving before anything else could go wrong, before anyone could stop her. Or so she had hoped. She heard the door open. Her mother has returned. Sona put her hands on her Etva, ready to make sure even she couldn't stop her. Lestara gave Sona one look before she signed, I'm coming with you. Sona chased her around the house, hand signing wildly so that she could see her, trying to tell her that she didn't even know where she was going. Lestara signed back at her that it didn't matter. She was going with her. She would pack her things and they would leave within the week. To Sona, it didn't feel fair. She didn't want to leave. This was her home, but without her father, could it ever be again? Often, when she didn't know what to do, she just played her Etva. And so, once again, she let her mournful melody drift out into the streets and to the Citadel. Those who heard it didn't know why they began to weep, but Sona knew. They cried for a man without equal, and they cried for the country he had once bettered with his presence, now forever changed in his absence. Sona knew, and so she wept as she played. And that was the absolutely amazing story about Sona's father. You see, this story seems to be a really awesome setup, and it has a lot of amazing tie-ins. You see, the parts from the past really did happen in the past. These happened when King Jarvan III was young, and the present days still happened in the past. It was before the Mageseekers grew in power and before Silas's rebellion. So you can start noticing some really cool details. At the end of this story, there is a brilliant tie-in to what happens in Sona's bio. Sona actually travels back to Ionia, where she gets to see the land after the Noxians devastated it, and Lestara traveled there with her. Of course, there she realized that her home was utterly devastated, and together with Lestara they then traveled back to Demacia. So that's why at the end of this story, Sona told Lestara that she didn't even know where she was going. It's because Sona was going to see Ionia again. Besides this, there are some really cool tie-ins to what happened during the rebellion. You see, Lestara donated the Bavel residence to the Great City, so that it could be turned into a library, which the Mageseekers would be interested in. And what's amazing is that in the Lux comic, we learned that the Mageseekers took over this library, and it is now known as simply the Mageseeker Library. So even though this is not directly confirmed anywhere, since the Bavel family was such a massive part of Demacia, it absolutely makes sense why this gigantic place would be formerly the Bavel residence. Especially since before then there hasn't been any other public library. This story then sets up another villain which might become a bigger character later on. We've heard about him before many times, and that's Eldred of the Mageseekers. Lord Eldred was especially mentioned a few times in the Garen novel, and his main point is that he is the leader of the Mageseekers, but at the same time, he and Diana Crownguard are married. Even though, as far as everyone knows, because it is obvious to the public eye, there is no romantic relationship between them. And here's the thing. The way Eldred was really trying to get on Lestara's nerve, it seems like Riot is pushing Eldred towards becoming a great villain. Which, in my opinion, he already is. We don't have a proper Mageseeker in the game. I know I say this for like every other character, but I truly believe that Eldred could be a unique champion. Just don't make him shirtless. Anyway, the point is that in this story they gave him a lot more background. He is married to Diana Crownguard, Lux's and Garen's aunt. But we also learned that Diana Crownguard was in charge of the military during the battle at the Gates of Morning. Whatever the reason why so many died there, it was because of Diana and her decisions. But despite that, we learned that when Diana came back, after a High Marshal died there, with High Marshal being the main leader of the Demacian military, she was appointed the next High Marshal despite her failure. Lestara mentioned that she still couldn't believe that, and that could be because there is more happening to this. You see, despite so many people dying, somehow Diana survived. And somehow Diana got a political power she wasn't supposed to get. And somehow, seemingly for absolutely no reason, she got married to Eldred of the Mageseekers. I haven't seen this theory on the internet yet, but I believe, since the Gates of Morning were taken down by the Noxians, it is possible that Diana's life was affected by the Black Rose. In the Garen novel, we have seen LeBlanc's clone in the east. LeBlanc does have influence over that area. Now, I don't believe that Diana herself would be mind-controlled by LeBlanc. The entire Garen novel happened because Diana actually discovered LeBlanc's influence in the east. But it is likely that Diana survived and she became the High Marshal because LeBlanc was moving the strings. Maybe LeBlanc wanted a weak leader in charge of the Demacian military. And maybe, because after Barrett's death, she was only Eldred's fiancée, maybe the two were forced to get married because once again LeBlanc was pulling some strings. Similarly to what was teased in the comic, it is possible that the entire Mage Rebellion and the King's death was caused by LeBlanc. But speaking of the King's death, let's talk about another thing. In the Legends of Runeterra cards, it was mentioned that LeBlanc had somehow affected King Jarvan III. Seeing that the point of his story was that he died, the cards also pointed at the fact that LeBlanc was the one who murdered him. But here's the thing. As we mentioned, the story of Lord Barrett is totally different than what we have seen in the cards. The cards are essentially not canon and they are a what-if scenario. Which makes me really sad, because now we simply don't know what is canon. Despite this story being absolutely amazing, it throws what we loved about Legends of Runeterra out the window. We loved how that game expanded the universe, but now it just shows characters without context. Which, sure, it is fine to see those dead characters back, but now they hold no value. And it takes down everything else around it too. Some of the crazy cool cards may not even be canon now. Von Yip, by far the best character of this year, may not even be getting to this point. Also, since the Barrett card is a what-if scenario, what if the LeBlanc quote in Jarvan's card is also a what-if scenario? What if all of these sentinels didn't really happen? What if Vygar is not building a giant mech? What if minions are not real? What if Heimerdinger is not making a T-Hex? You see what I mean? Because of this story and what happened with these cards, the lore of Legends of Runeterra can't be taken seriously anymore. It is not a reliable source of lore. But what's worse, while it didn't enhance the universe, it damaged it. Now you are forced into ignoring the cards in the game. Otherwise, you will confuse yourselves, and you will not know what actually happened to Lord Barrett. This is a massive mistake, and I can't stretch how much I hate this. Honestly, if I was at Riot, just change the art. Lord Barrett is obviously an amazing character. And if you want to turn Eldred into a really cool villain, which you can absolutely do, you need all the lore connections to be clean. Otherwise, this will taint the story which you are trying to set up. Oh, it's all what-if scenarios. That's why the Arbiter wasn't there during the Ruination.